This is Legislature's The Inside Story. Thank you for listening. I am the host, Tim Storey, CEO of the National Conference of State Legislatures. My guest is Bruce Mehlman, founder and partner in Mehlman Consulting, a D.C-based bipartisan lobbying firm whose clients include Walmart, AARP, Boeing, the Mayo Clinic, and many other big players in American politics and policy. Mehlman's perspective is also shaped by his experience as an Assistant Secretary of Commerce in the George W. Bush administration and his time in private industry. I wanted to sit down with him because he always has a savvy take on how Washington's working, and he sees the day's events with historical perspective that is often missing from a lot of the political analysis. Bruce talked about the forces shaping the political world, including the people around the world in recent years, and how they voted for change, and makes it clear that they're unhappy with the status quo. The challenge that poses to our institutions may well lead to significant economic, political, and social reforms in our time. We also talked about Bruce's slide decks that over the years have become well known among policy wonks because of their clear, data-driven, and often humorous analysis of political and economic trends. Bruce Mehlman, what a joy to have you on the podcast. I've absolutely been looking forward to this since we set this up a few days ago. Welcome. Thank you. This is a podcast for people in legislature world. There's a podcast for everything. There's actually a new TV commercial out. I don't know if you've seen it. I saw it during the football game last night that's sort of making fun of the fact that there's a podcast for every niche. Well, our niche is legislature world. There's not a ton of competing podcasts for legislature world. So with that set up, thanks a lot for being with us, Bruce.
It's an honor to be here. The challenge, I think, for you is you guys do such amazing data work. You have such awesome information, and obviously a podcast can convey ideas, but not all those charts, not all the data that I regularly come to your awesome resources for to really understand trends. So thanks for what you do.
You bet. I mean, it's an amazing organization. I will never miss a chance to tout our prowess in legislature ecosystem, and I appreciate that. And we do a whole lot, man, and on every policy issue you can imagine and what legislatures are working on. So I appreciate hearing that. Like I said, people know where you work and your sort of immediate background, but, can you in 60 seconds or less, or maybe however many, 65 seconds, how did you get to this gig? I mean, what is your deeper background? Where are you from? I always like to know, like, where people grew up and then, and start when you were just a wee lad in wherever you were from.
I'm a Baltimorean, so I grew up when the Colts were a storied Baltimore franchise with Johnny Unitas and others. But in the dark of night, Bob Irsay secreted the team out to Indianapolis, a scarring event in my childhood. Went to college in New Jersey at Princeton, went to law school at UVA, so I kind of Amtrak quartered the whole time. Came straight to D.C. as a lawyer at a law firm first, but then a lawyer at a political party committee. Nobody wants to pay or tell the truth to lawyers at political party committees, so I'm like, I'm out of here. And I went to do legislative work for J.C. Watts when he became part of House Republican leadership back when it was much more functional. Jumped from there to Cisco Systems, a high-tech company, from there to the Bush administration as an Assistant Secretary of Commerce. And then in 2 months, it will be 20 years ago that I left the federal government and began a bipartisan lobbying firm, which is where I am sitting today.
And what do you do on a daily basis? What does bipartisan lobbying firm look like in your, I assume there's not really an average day, but let's conjure up some imaginary world where there's an average day. What are you doing?
Yeah, look, I'm always despairing that people, I think, unfairly malign the lobbying work. I think it's valuable. I think it's necessary. And I think if you got rid of everybody who does it today, you would literally reinvent it. And I can explain why if you'd like. But the average day, maybe one step back. What do? We do three things. We help clients, often businesses, but sometimes organizations. So we represent AARP to Starbucks and Walmart and Boeing and a whole lot of wonderful folks in between. So the three roles are: first, understand what's happening. What are government stakeholders, in our case at the federal level, thinking about? What are they planning to do? What have they introduced? What's likely to pass? Where are things probably going to go, and what motivates people? That's one, understand. Two, anticipate. How will the conversation over Israel and Hamas impact Ukraine funding, or how will it impact U.S.-China policy? What's next in trade? If there is a second Biden term, how would that differ from a second Trump term? So one, understand; two, anticipate; and three, engage. Be part of the conversation. Most elected officials at this federal and state level know a whole lot about the industry that they personally worked in, but they don't always know all that much about every other industry. And most responsible legislators want to talk to employers, want to talk to innovators, want to understand, hey, I'm thinking about doing something to make the water cleaner. If this is what I propose with this language, how will it impact you? Most businesses have an opinion about how things would impact them. And while lawmakers shouldn't always roll over for one industry, they want to take in inputs from all directions. The shaping and sharing of opinions and perspectives is necessary if you want government to get the policy right. So we help people understand, we help people anticipate, and we help people impact what government stakeholders do.
So could not agree more. I mean, NCSL, we partner with a great number of government relations, private sector folks, and just the information that brings to the process at the state level is absolutely crucial. And of course, the general public, let's not stereotype. Let's say 99.8% of the general public has no clue. Right? It is a word laden with emotional reaction. The lobbyist and the special interest, but of course, we appreciate the value and how that works. Similar at the state capitol level, except I will say, the big difference is vast majority of legislators, they have another job. So they're what you were talking about in terms of wanting to do your diligence as a federal legislator. In the states, it's even more complex because you've got this other demand for 90% of them.
No, look, you're right, and the reason it becomes so important is you have your average legislator who has a job, most of whom are not in the medical field, let's say. They'll do healthcare. They care about it. Their constituents care about it, but they're not doctors. They're not hospital administrators. So you take those folks. They're going to need help from people who understand more about the specific domain. And while I'm sure they've got a great and energetic staff, they don't have the world's greatest experts on every aspect of healthcare. So what they'll do is they'll reach out and think, well, who really understands healthcare? The type of people they'll reach out to are people like my client, the Mayo Clinic, frequently rated the #1 hospital in the world, which is great. If you ever spend time there, they have unbelievable doctors and nurses and administrators. And you know what they do? They spend their time treating patients. They do healthcare. But somebody has to sit between the elected officials who don't understand healthcare and want feedback, and the nurses and the doctors who want to be in the operating rooms and want to be with patients who don't have the time to spend, a day a week walking lawmakers and legislators through ideas. Like, well, how about this? Would this be good? Would that be good? In the same way, if you want to explain yourself in a courtroom, you hire a lawyer to help you make your case. If you want to sell a house, you hire people who sell houses. If you want to sell potato chips, you hire people who put together smart advertising. If you have opinions on public policy, you hire people who understand how the public policy process works.
Absolutely true. And I think what they do know is their constituents are coming at them and saying, I'm really worried about my data on the internet, or they're really worried about the housing crisis and the fact that their kids can't afford a house or they can't afford a house, and that there's also people without a house, right? So these legislators know that, but what they quickly realize there are 48 layers to this problem. It is not just, hey, what can you do to fix or to work on data privacy or AI, whatever, workforce. We can't find enough teachers, can't find enough people to work in prisons. Go on and on and on. Healthcare, you name it. Bruce, I will say, I feel like, and you correct me if this is not fair, you've become the guy with this slide deck. Is this now are you branded the guy with the greatest slide deck in Washington in our public policy conversation? And explain to people what I'm talking about.
Well, so I don't know if being branded such is a good or bad thing. Few people are listening to this, I suspect, thinking, I wish I were branded the lobbyist in Washington with the slide deck. That's, the good news is it's not a crazy amount of competition. So the short version is I put out on a quarterly basis, and any of your listeners who are interested can sign up by emailing me. My advice is I would suggest either find me on LinkedIn or find me on Twitter at BPMEHLMAN. It's my pinned tweet is the most recent one, and run through it real quick. And if you hate it, don't sign up because they're all just like that. And if you love it because you're a nerd on policy and politics, reach out. What I try to do on a quarterly basis is try to look at some of the trends in policy and politics, marry them up with things that are happening more broadly in technology or globalization or American culture, with a big heavy dose of sort of historical perspective. And I try to take that wild stew of stuff and turn it into infographics that are data rich, that are hopefully somewhat amusing, that are not what everybody hates about PowerPoint, which is a memo in prose that just simply is on slides because that's a memo. Tries to give a little bit of perspective on what's happening, why, what does it mean, where's it likely to go. I find so much of my job requires my understanding on the day by day, week by week, hour by hour basis. Who's going to be the speaker? What's the legislation up next week? What are they going to have a hearing on? And that's really important stuff. But I found some combination of, because I read a lot of history, because I want sanity, and because of a lot of our clients, CEOs in particular, are less interested in the play-by-play, and they want more color commentary. What's the big picture? Why is U.S.-China policy moving in this direction? Do you think we're in some kind of COVID-induced anti-globalization spasm that's going to kind of return or correct to the world that we've been living in? And by the way, spoiler, no, we're in a new deglobalizing world. It allows me to get my thoughts together to share ideas that a lot of clients and a lot of people who put on conferences and a lot of individuals enjoy. I'll be honest, what I really love is every now and then I'll get like the email from I get this one guy is a high school history teacher in Oregon. And he'll regularly say, hey, do you care if I share this with my class? Now, on the first, it's public, so you can share whatever you want with your class. It's nice of him to ask, but I love that. That's so cool if what I'm able to do following the Russia invasion of Ukraine is to help not only CEOs try to war game and plan out their supply chains, but high school history teachers offer some context to what the hell is happening in the world and why.
Well, I'm just going to cut to the chase for our tens of thousands of listeners. You should go right now and sign up for it because I it's heavily endorsed because I think it's this really. I think you found this wonderful niche. You clearly have tremendous communication skills. I've seen you speak a handful of times, and I've seen you in this domain. Last time I checked, I have seen 18,409 PowerPoint presentations, and yours is obviously something that the doctor ordered because it's so concise and kind of gets both into the depth and at the higher level with just a perfect balance. So you are doing something I think that is somewhat unique in my mind, in my experience, and that's what makes it kind of magic. Speaking of the magic, let's pivot to let's maybe spend the last half of this conversation talking about where things stand. I mean, you and I are recording this. The United States House Republican Conference is meeting. I'm still trying to select a speaker. Now, if you're listening to this in a week or so, when we get this posted, this could be any number of days, right? Because you don't know which day I just referred to. We'll just let people know we're on the Friday when Scalise has now dropped out and all that. So there's this. This is just one of the many things. And look, we live in a complex world. There are always currents at play. What's your current state of the game in terms of where the federal governance goes and what that means for the political landscape in 2024, as well as the policy landscape? That's a big question. And you got, our podcast is only for another 20 minutes or so. So
I was going to say, give me the answer in 60 seconds. Well, look, so first, thank you for all the nice, kind things that you said. It's a labor of love, although what's funny, too, is that as anybody who's listening, whichever writes anything or otherwise creates anything knows, if you're lucky, the version the world sees looks really well done and almost looks easy. And what they don't see is 8 feet of torn up trial and error, drafts and stuff that fully sucked before you finally got to somewhere between passing and good. So it's awesome and appreciated. I appreciate your saying that. So on the bigger picture of where we are, I mean, I don't know whether there'll be a speaker today or this week or next week. Obviously, there will be a speaker. To me, it's much less about whether, is it going to be Mr. Jordan? Is it going to be Mr. McHenry? Is it going to be somebody we don't know? It's more the macro, the bigger trends. And the bigger trends are that the rise of populism all around the world reflects the fact that for so many citizens, the policies, the parties, and the institutions that govern their lives aren't getting the job done. They were created in the 20th century for the 20th century. So you talk about data privacy that, it wasn't figured out in the 20th century. And on a myriad of topics, whether it's how globalization works or what AI is going to mean for work, or the future of energy, people feel fragile. And so as a result, they were voting for populists. That was true, in Brazil, Bolsonaro. That was true AMLO in Mexico, Boris Johnson and the Brexiteers in the UK, or Modi in India. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were the faces of movements that preceded both of them here in the United States. People are stressed out at the accelerating disruption in their lives. They're voting for change. They're turning to populists. With the Democrats, that led for a while to, the very left wing of the left wing, people like the Squad and others going after historically embraced things. Joe Biden, who's the current president, did the 3 strikes and you're outlaw. He's kind of always been in the center of the Democratic Party, and he's way to the left of where he used to be, because that's where the center of the Democratic Party is. In the Republican Party, the populism takes the form of being not only against Washington and against the establishment, but particularly against the Republican establishment. And even if you're an outsider, as soon as you dethrone the insiders and become the new lead, you are instantly the establishment. And, we're getting to the point where our speaker may or may not last as long as Liz Truss, who didn't outlast the head of lettuce. To me, what the core trend is this just reflects the same thing animating all that populism. And in the Republican Party, the way you get visibility is attack Leader McConnell, attack Speaker Boehner, Speaker Ryan, Speaker McCarthy, attack all the people running against Trump, be populist. That's how you get seen. That's how you get funded. That's how you see your path forward. The challenge is that's just no path for long-term successful governance.
There's multiple things here to dive into. You made this comment about institutions, sort of the stress on institutions and that this populism movement. And I also heard you say, you're a student of history. So you sort of feel like nothing's new here, right? This is something we've seen before. There are unique dynamics of technology and change and globalization and deglobalization. So then how do institutions evolve? Where do you see this going? Because I'm thinking about state institutions, and many of the same dynamics are very much at play.
Thankfully, you're right. There is historical precedent for so much of this stuff. American history feels like one long series of people lamenting that things aren't as good as they used to be. And yet, objectively, each generation has lived longer, has had more wealth, has had more access to extraordinary things, whether it's travel or technology or entertainment, than their preceding generation. So I'm definitely a long-term optimist. Institutions, though, typically are brought about often by people who are unhappy with change, deciding they were needed. They figure out how to become relevant to the time that they're built. Then over time, they are likely to become a little bit more sclerotic. If they're good and dynamic, like the United States Constitution tried to make the United States, they can last a pretty long time. But as with the Constitution, at some point, you need amendments. You need things to be improved. Sometimes you need an institution to go away. Other times you need institutions to do a big reform. I tend to think the period we're in now is most akin, and as you know, I did a slide deck on this back in 2017, but I think we're in a new Gilded Age. If you go back and you look at America in the Gilded Age, you had people feeling disrupted by accelerating new technologies. It was the electricity and the railroads and telegraph and then telephones, flight and automobiles, number one. Number two, you had historic levels of immigration causing really nasty culture wars about whether more immigration was better or immigration was changing the character of the country in ways that people objected to. You had in the Gilded Age, you got to the highest level of inequality in American history until today. or actually technically a couple of years ago, but modern times. And you had people feeling like the political system was broken, where the richest 0.01% were unduly influencing elections, and so you had red states and blue states stuck. If that sounds like today, yep. If that sounds like the Gilded Age, that's exactly what it was. What happened that helped us get through that was an era of reforms. Teddy Roosevelt and Taft were Republicans. Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat, all of whom advanced stuff. In some of them, FDR kind of picked up and followed through to the end, but you had economic reforms. So the Google and Microsoft of their day were Standard Oil and Carnegie Steel. They invented antitrust law to have economic policy fit that new 20th century reality. There was worker safety law, food safety law, drug. In the old days, you knew a drug, a pharmaceutical was unsafe if people taking it were dying. They decided maybe we want an expert agency to assess whether it's safe and effective first. So that wasn't a thing until then. Child labor was a regular thing until they fixed it. So those are the economic reforms. You had political reforms, direct election of senator, giving women the constitutional right to vote, prohibiting corporate contributions and union contributions to political campaigns. And there were social reforms. Students finished in 8th grade at the start of the 20th century in almost every part of the country. And business leaders starting in the Northeast, but going around the country in your world, Tim, it's at the state and local level. And they realized, hey, there's this new industrial era and America's not adequately ready. How about if we have the students go to 9th through 12th grade, paid for by taxpayers, and learning the skills that are relevant to this new industrial era? The opponents decried it and said, oh my God, that's socialism. Today we call it high school. And it didn't kill American capitalism. It meant that the American capitalist system had the greatest workforce, enabling us to be the arsenal of democracy that defeated fascism and to have the capabilities to outcompete communism. The 20th century was the American century very much because of the reforms that took a broken, stuck, frustrating system of the Gilded Age and brought it into the 20th century. I think we're amidst that same sort of thing happening for the 21st. It feels horrible, but I bet it did back then too.
There's so many parallels, right? And one of which is that it hits people with the economic, where they're very economic confidence and security at a time when how will technology upend jobs? Which you were talking about, how would electricity? I mean, there were people who probably millions of the buggy drivers had to adjust to vehicles coming on the scene and all of this. You used the term accelerating disruption earlier, which is a wonderful phrase. I do think a little bit about the speed at which technological advances hit us now. I mean, the evolution of electricity and vehicles and these things, there was a lot more time for the humans of that era to cope with these things. But we're in, these technologies, they come and they're integrated into our lives extremely quickly. The smartphone, artificial intelligence. It leads to the question, what are the institutional changes that you see happening that are most likely to happen? We are going to adjust, and we're going to go through some era of upheaval, and this is really just all a reflection of a cycle that we have seen before. What will be the institutional changes?
Well, first, you're right that the pace is accelerating, and technology is driving that. The flip side, of course, is the ability to reskill. In the old days, like how would you do it in the old days? Would you apprentice somewhere? And the technology also brings us more information, more capability to learn. In the case of some of this new AI stuff, often a way to quickly go from not knowing much and mediocre to having the assistance to get to pretty solid pretty fast on things that maybe used to take a long amount of time. So I am worried about a lot of that, but there are technologies that help people learn faster, just like technologies displace things faster. I do worry about on the parenting side and as a parent of 3, but
we could have a whole podcast about that as a parent of 3.
Well, you need a guest with a lot more competence. I mean, in some ways, I think I'm lucky, or I credit my wife. I'm a big fan of my kids, but it was more by accident than by genius or design. As for the institutional stuff, it feels again like we're looking at economic reforms, political reforms and social reforms. So, on the economic reforms, we know that the safety nets are both in some ways insufficient and in other ways unaffordable. So we all sort of pretend nobody's allowed to talk about whether we are going to be able to have the money to keep the safety nets the way we've got them. But realistically, we're just going to, get to the breaking point, and then we're going to have to figure it out. It may be driven by U.S. debt, and it may be driven by the fact that at some point interest is going to cost. At some point, like literally over the next couple of years, our annual interest spend will be more than $1 trillion just paying interest on debt that prior generations have accrued. So we're going to need to figure out how to do some of that. On technology, America's been great at having a pretty free market that lets innovators move fast and break things, to coin a phrase. But they also move fast and broke things. We're not so great at consumer protection, particularly now that technology is both ubiquitous and super powerful in the form of AI. And for that matter, some of the cyber tools and bio increasingly. We're going to need to come up with ways that don't kill the golden goose, but that improve a little bit of consumer protection in the either internet, or if you think of AI as digital or internet adjacent space. But there are going to need to be rules that there haven't been, in the same way that fintech is a thing and crypto has its positive uses. The right regulatory framework would allow that to be more consistently constructive and less Sam Bankman-Fried and kind of crazy. I think those are some of the reforms. Something around education as well, where the inequality in part is driven because we're in a superstar economy where those with more skills and access to capital and education have a lead, and the lead use of technology is growing. Well, we're going to have to find ways to create opportunities for more people to know the dignity of work, to leverage technological tools to succeed. We're already seeing some reforms where there was a the meritocracy myth, and this belief that if you went to Harvard or an Ivy, then you're either smarter or more deserving. And anybody who's been in the workforce knows that's bogus. But the hiring world has absolutely put more stock in what was never a particularly fair competition and is rigged in different ways today. So I think what we educate people on, my oldest, who's a great math science guy, said instead of a language, he'd like to take computer coding. And the school's like, no, you've got to take, Latin or French or Spanish. It's like, really? Was that the right way to do it? Think we send kids to schools today in an industrial setting on an agrarian timetable and tell them that, they need to master what they need to understand for the digital age. There's a lot that needs to change, but so many people are invested in the way we've done things. And if you get change wrong, you make people worse off. So it's painful.
You touched on, I think, mostly as sort of placeholders, but, big issues, immigration and disruption of the workforce there. And do you see the federal government solving these problems? I mean, as someone who thinks, frankly, that the states are just leading on this, but maybe just out of necessity, because there just seems to be so little policy guidance and problem solving coming from the federal government right now. And maybe it's just a temporary thing because of the politics of the moment. Are you optimistic that the national government is up to this task?
I am medium and especially long-term very optimistic. I am short-term pessimistic / scared to death. Ultimately, I think, and you know this better than I, but so much of the history of great policy were experiments at state or local levels that caught on to other state and local levels because they're smart, because they're good, because they're the right way to do urban development, or the right way to do education, or the right way to have a public-private partnership with universities and local businesses. And as these things prove out and they catch on, at some point there becomes a federal law that nationalizes what are ultimately best practices that were invented in the laboratories of state experimentation.
Yeah, I think that's the case now and keeps happening, and probably more important than ever. And again, states They have to balance their budgets. They have deadlines that, they don't have infinite session. Most of them, these are dates they have to get things done. So they get things done. So I think they'll keep leading the way. What about the politics of the moment? What do you see let's just quickly talk about the political landscape over the next, 12 months. I mean, I guess we're closing in on a year out from the big kahuna, the national election. What's your big brain telling you about that?
Telling me to drink. As you saw in the most recent thing I published last week, I mean, this is setting up to be the least anticipated sequel since Caddyshack 2. Trump v. Biden 2024 is the movie nobody wants to see. 2/3 of Americans say, really? We're a nation of 330 million people and we're going back to these knuckleheads? But it's really hard for me to kind of think through what's the scenario, what would happen that would cause, say, Trump to not be the Republican nominee. I mean, he's had people running him against him, talented people running against him again, like they had in 2016, and yet he's growing his lead. The idea that he might say something so impolitic he'd lose support is belied by the fact that he's already said as much as you can possibly come up with that's off the charts in politics. He's like opposition research proof, because even the craziest Oppo researchers would never have dreamed that they'd have come up with the stuff that actually happened. And yet, it's not even Teflon. He's like Godzilla. A nuclear bomb goes off and he seems stronger than he saw before. Maybe, I mean, I mentioned this in the report, the 3 potential exit ramps for him. First, if every other Republican got out tomorrow except Nikki Haley, I think that'd be a hell of a contest. She is a very talented person. She is normal in many, many ways. So all of the we don't want Trump again could coalesce around one person. That ain't going to happen. DeSantis ain't getting out. He would say coalesce around me. And all these other folks don't seem like they're going to get out. But even if they did, it's not obvious that she'd beat him. But I think she's the most talented player in the field. Personal editorial observations. That's one. Is the field could winnow to mano a womano, and then maybe. Number 2, he is a 77-year-old overweight male. The actuarial tables suggest maybe, health stuff could intervene, though, as now Congressman, former White House doctor Ronnie Jackson allegedly wrote, he's the healthiest human being in the history of the presidency, so maybe not. Number 3, it's very much within the realm of possibility that he could be both convicted and, for that matter, even incarcerated. It feels like that could leave a mark in a way that nothing else had, but there won't be new facts that come out in these trials that change the mind of Republican primary voters, so I think he's the nominee. For Mr. Biden, he is 4 years older than Mr. Trump, and while physically, I hope I'm in as good a shape as he is when I'm 81. Guy's riding a bike. Yeah, he fell over one time, but, I fell over riding a bike when I was 20, so I'm going to cut the guy a break. Now, in press conferences, you get the sense that he's not near what he used to be, and you wonder if if it were a Nikki Haley, could he actually debate her, or would that be a moment of high cringe? We don't know. But so health is one, Hunter is number 2. The president's son, Hunter Biden, has had all kind of issues that are currently have him indicted and dealing with federal law. And crazily, the Department of Justice that reports to Mr. Biden is also actually prosecuting Mr. Biden's son. He's obviously a devoted dad. The idea that he might pardon his son instead of having him potentially go to jail, maybe he'd be he'd have a Republican cellmate. But if he did that, I think he'd decide, all right, I'm pardoning my kid, but I'm not running with that. I'm doing that and dropping out. Again, that's a wild theory. So that'd be maybe number 2. And maybe number 3 is, notwithstanding whatever is happening with Mr. Trump and all the indictments, Trump's still, on average, winning the head-to-head polling contests. So theoretically, just like all the Republicans except Haley could get out and that could be tight, in theory, all the national Democrats could say, we're not going to win this thing, and we need to pull the plug and put in, a Gavin Newsom or a Gretchen Whitmer or somebody else, because we think the odds of the winnability go down if there's a recession and all these other things that could happen. It's time to go to the bullpen. But, if you had to bet, assume it's a rematch.
Taking what you just said about the landscape and what's going to happen next year, Let me just say, what percentage of voters do you think are actually persuadable? I mean, you see different numbers about this, but when you factor that through your filter of what you've seen in history, who's truly willing to say, oh, I could go for Trump, I could go for Biden? And then does it only matter in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, this, really just in 7 states?
Well, so first, yes, the election only matters in the 7 swing states or 8, whatever the number is. And otherwise, it's a fait accompli no matter what, number one. Number two, the share of voters who are truly independent are often put, like by Dave Wasserman at Cook, who's as good as anybody ever on stuff like this, at maybe 9 to 12% of the electorate isn't heavily leaning in one way or another. And persuadable in a Trump v. Biden is very different than persuadable if there were a fresh, different candidate. So you saw a lot of historic Republicans vote for Barack Obama in a way you might not have thought of. You saw that as well with a lot of lifelong Democrats back in '84 vote for Ronald Reagan. Bill Clinton won some people over, and in 2004, W won some people over. A lot depends on what's happening in the world, what the alternative is, who the other party has put up, whether the candidate seems viable and attractive, or even inspires hope, or in the case of a rematch, it's like we were saying, it's hard to imagine too many new facts changing minds. There's such incredibly strong opinions about Biden and Trump that I feel like their ceilings and their floors are made out of steel.
Which could be sort of exhausting for folks like us who are sort of paying attention to this world, and we know, I know legislators, I know legislative staff. These are people who care deeply about solving problems and trying to help people, and there's just a real sense of exasperation that seems to have settled upon our land in our little niche world of people in policy and politics. We're going to bring it to a close here. What a delightful conversation, Bruce. I just always love your insights. And I will say a couple things. The historic perspective is so important. We just feel so in the moment. And, there are major wars in our world today, and there have been wars before. We have to understand that, we will go through these things with a great deal of suffering, which is so awful. But, history can tell us so much about our times. I was reminded of a story. My mom, who had not traveled out of the country, she went to Ireland when she was older, and she came back and she showed us this picture of a bunch of rocks just in a field. And I said to her, well, Mom, why'd you take a picture of this pile of rocks? She said, oh, Oliver Cromwell came through and destroyed this bridge. And then she just had massive scorn for Oliver Cromwell. And I'm like, mine was like 500 years ago. I think it's time to maybe we let go and move on. And I couldn't help but remember that story when you brought up your grudge against Irsay taking the Colts in the dead of night from Baltimore. So I'm just going to pass that along to you as well, Bruce. Maybe it's time to move on.
Well, look, then the Baltimore stole the Browns from Cleveland. So, yes, I may not like the Irsays because of what they did to my old rooting team, but Baltimore has no moral leg to stand on. Tim, thank you for having me.
I've been talking with Bruce Mehlman, founder and partner at Mehlman Consulting, a D.C-based bipartisan lobbying firm about the state of American politics and governance. Thank you for joining me and Bruce on this episode of Legislatures, The Inside Story, brought to you by the National Conference of State Legislatures.
You can check out all the podcasts from the National Conference of State Legislatures by searching for NCSL Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. Tim Storey, NCSL's CEO, hosts Legislatures, The Inside Story, where he focuses on leadership in legislatures. The Our American States podcast dives into some of the most challenging public policy issues facing legislators. On Across the Aisle, host Kelly Griffin tells stories of bipartisanship. Also, check out our special series, Building Democracy, on the history of legislatures.